Ooh. I'm trying to break things up here. All right, so we had just talked about reinforcers. We don't have any. What is this? Uh-oh. Did I break it again? Seriously? Ah, there we go. All right. Let me finish tearing apart the podium. So, we had been talking already that reinforcers are any event that strengthens the behavior that follows it. A primary reinforcer, something that is innately reinforcing. And we talked about a secondary reinforcer being some sort of learned reinforcer that is associated with a primary reinforcer. So we talked about clicker training with dogs as being an example of secondary reinforcers, as money as an example of secondary reinforcers, where things like food and sex are primary reinforcers. So this is where we left off, as I recall, last Monday. So, as we start talking about reinforcement, there are two different types of reinforcement. There is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Reinforcers always increase the probability of a behavior. So, that is, they are things that animals or people like. A positive reinforcer is the addition of something pleasurable. So this is reinforcement with food, some sort of reward. In animal studies, they can stimulate the nucleus accumbens or other parts of the brain to stimulate a feeling of reward. We'll talk more about that kind of thing here in a moment. Give them food, that sort of thing. In humans, it's usually, praise or some sort of basic reward, food, chocolate, candy, sex, that sort of thing. Negative reinforcers are the removal of something aversive. And that is to say, it's the taking away of something painful, irritating, annoying. So for animals, typically this is the, we might use shock, for example, and then taking away that shock is that kind of negative reinforcement. I've used examples of, I'll put on a really annoying beep and leave it on for a minute, and then once it shuts off, that's kind of reinforcing for people because that's really annoying. So anytime you're removing something aversive, that's reinforcing because we feel better by getting rid of that, whatever bad thing is happening. So we're still reinforcing the behavior because the animal or person's better off, but it's the removal of something, and that's what makes it negative, is we're taking something away. Converse that with punishment. Punishment is designed to reduce the probability of a behavior. And again, we also have positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment is the administration of something aversive. So it's the addition, that's why it's positive, of something aversive. This is where we introduce a shock. It's used in both people and animals. Corporal punishment would be an example of punishment. That is some sort of physical punishment. Any sort of administration of some sort of something aversive would be a positive form of punishment. Negative punishment is the taking away of things that we like. So it's the removal of pleasurable stimuli to decrease the behavior. This is parents taking away phones, that sort of thing. Pretty simple. For animals, you can take away food or take away some sort of pleasing behavior. The reinforcement and punishment are kind of opposite sides of the coin, and they can oftentimes work together. You oftentimes have to think about what's reinforcing for an animal versus what's punishing. Same thing with people. Mistake I talk about a lot in my human sexuality classes is when people try to use negative punishment in their relationships by withholding things like sex. It's not a particularly good relationship building strategy, but it's something certainly people have been known to do. More often we're usually talking about things like, taking away your phone or your car, grounding you, which has probably got some negative and positive punishment aspects to it, right? Forcing you to stay at home. That's no fun. That makes it a positive punishment. Not letting you go and do things you want to do makes it negative punishment. So you have to think about these things from all angles. We're going to revisit the guys from The Big Bang Theory. Okay. What? Okay. Why do we hear two of these at once? Okay, let's back this up. Try that again. I don't know why it was playing itself twice at the same time. Try this again. All right. So let's quick look at the difference between positive punishment and negative reinforcement. I'll let you look over this. The basic issue in learning is one of the issues that happens is oftentimes we reinforce negative behavior in ways that we don't expect. And it's something to be cautious of because one of the things that's important to understand about reinforcement is how often you reinforce a behavior depends on how sort of strongly you reinforce that behavior. You would think continuous reinforcement would actually result in the strongest learning, and early on it actually does. So in a continuous reinforcement, every time a behavior occurs, it's reinforced. You get rapid acquisition of a behavior this way. So oftentimes in sort of early stages of trying to train animals or humans, you use sort of continuous reinforcement paradigms. The problem is if you don't continually reinforce them or don't continue to reinforce them, then extinction of that behavior is pretty rapid. So instead, we often use partial reinforcement schedules. And a partial reinforcement schedule is just what it sounds like. Rather than reinforcing every behavior, you just reinforce behavior some of the time. And there are a variety of ways to do this. So we reinforce the behavior only part of the time. In this case, acquisition is a little bit slower because the person or animal is not necessarily associating their behavior with reward as quickly. But it does lead to greater resistance to extinction. And that's the problem when you partially reinforce a behavior, you're actually making that behavior much more likely than you are if you're even reinforcing it every time. So if, for example, a child is throwing a temper tantrum and they're rewarded on occasion for that, they're going to keep doing that sort of thing. So one of the reasons why consistency is so important in parenting, that they sort of never get rewarded for that kind of behavior, because otherwise you sort of create an even larger problem by this kind of partial reinforcement. So the 4 different kinds of reinforcement schedules we talk about are fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. So a fixed ratio schedule is when a behavior is reinforced after a fixed number of responses. So this is shown here. Very rapid responding, but you do get extinction a little bit more quickly. But the animals respond very quickly because they keep trying to get to that 10th response, because they know every 10th response or every 11th response or whatever it is, they'll get reinforced. The variable ratio schedule of reinforcement is actually the most powerful and the least likely to be extinguished. So rather than reinforcing the animal every 10th response, it's a random variable that might be on average every 10 responses, but it might be 2 responses and then 20 responses and then 3 responses. You get pretty rapid responding, and this is definitely the most powerful reward schedule that results in the least likely possibility of extinction. This is essentially how slot machines work. Slot machines are designed to reinforce you on occasion, but you have no idea, it's impossible to predict how often you might be reinforced. That's the reason why people sit at them for hours on end, because they are basically just like pigeons in a box pecking at that key. They're waiting to get reinforced again or waiting to get rewarded again. So that kind of variable ratio schedule reinforcement results in fast acquisition and is much less likely to show extinction than a fixed ratio schedule. Fixed ratio schedule, once you've gotten 2 rounds of not getting reinforced, you'll stop getting responding. So we get high response rates, and it's highly resistant to extinction. This is also one of the most sort of naturalistic types of reinforcement schedules, because as we interact with each other and get rewarded for some behaviors and not others, this is kind of how most everything works, right? We occasionally get rewarded, but not every time, well, certainly not every 10th time. The fixed interval and variable interval schedules show slower rates of responding, but again, pretty stable rates of responding. So a fixed interval schedule occurs when you get reinforced after a fixed time period. So you get slower responses, but the rate increases as the time for the reward approaches. It's pretty much how everyone's paycheck works, right? So if you work a job, you get paid every other Friday or twice a month or once a month like we do here. In theory, I guess, we're supposedly working harder as that approaches. Usually it's because I don't have any money left over to do anything by the time the end of the month arrives. But in animal training, we see this kind of basic pattern of responding by increasing rates as we approach the reward deadline. In a variable interval schedule, basically the same thing. Responses are reinforced after some unpredictable time lag. So really, there's no relationship between the animal's behavior and reinforcement. So it just basically slowly and steadily keeps responding. So this produces slow but steady responses. And there's decades of research behind these. This gives you kind of an example of what it would look like if an animal was responding. Basically, it's a rat pressing a lever, or pigeon pecking a key, or somebody pulling the lever on a slot machine. All basically you get the same kind of responses. Gambling has a whole science and behavioral science behind it, where they've put a lot of money in trying to figure out how to keep you in a casino and how to keep you plopping money down. And a lot of it has to do with that variable ratio reinforcement schedule. They do a lot of research in terms of how to make that payoff seem very reinforcing. It used to be they would design the machine so when the coins came out of it, made the most pleasing sound, the most reinforcing sound. Now, of course, it's all electronic, so they try to come up with a way to make it the most pleasing and reinforcing sound and visual display as possible. All of this to just keep you gambling. So some applications of operant conditioning. We use operant conditioning in behavior modification therapy, where we're trying to modify an individual's behavior by reinforcing good behavior. Certainly gambling is a direct example of operant conditioning. People keep gambling to try to get that reinforcement. People who gamble, certainly people who are addicted to gambling, get a high that's not really that unlike drugs like cocaine. It's the same reward system we're going to talk about here in a moment. Certainly of a different quality, but it involves all of the same neural pathways. So that's where we're going to turn next, is to talk a little bit about the reward pathway, because underlying this entire process of reinforcement is a neural system called the reward pathway. This is a huge area of research because this is at the direct center of a whole field of neuroscience called neuroeconomics, where people are trying to look at how the reward pathway is involved in things like investment decisions, in shopping decisions, how people become price sensitive, etc. So I want to start with a quick overview of the various parts of the reward pathway, and we'll talk about its functional properties. So the major components of the reward pathway include the hypothalamus. It seems to be involved in everything important. Certainly feelings of reward are partially mediated by the hypothalamus, involved in sexual behavior, involved in eating behavior. All sorts of regulatory behaviors are governed by the hypothalamus. We'll talk about the mesolimbic pathway and the mesocortical pathway and how they interact with places like the prefrontal cortex, nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and the amygdala. So these parts of the brain are all involved in how rewards help generate and influence our behavior. First thing to note is that dopamine plays a critical role in reward. Won't get into the great dirty details of this process, but just understand that anything that involves dopamine has the potential to involve the reward pathway, and certainly all of our feeling of reward comes from the neurotransmitter dopamine. So when we talk about drugs like cocaine affecting the dopamine pathway, this is how they're affecting people who use those drugs, as they get this sense of reward through a release of dopamine. This is also people who gamble get that same dopamine release. It's also involved in sex, chocolate, all sorts of things actually provide this kind of dopamine release and that feeling of reinforcement. So a lot of our feelings of pleasure come from this particular neurotransmitter. But we'll spend most of the next few minutes talking about the functional anatomy of the reward pathways, because this is how they actually work. So without getting into the nitty-gritty details of all of the neurobiology, I want to talk about how they actually function, because this actually tells us a lot more about how rewards influence our behavior. So we'll start with what's called the reward prediction error signal, then talk about incentive salience, reward euphoria, and then finally habit formation and anticipation of reward. So the reward prediction error signal occurs when neurons that initially respond to the presence of a reward start responding to their sensory cues. So part of this is classical conditioning. So now the sensory cue is causing an automatic response, just like they would if the reward was present. So this is how operant conditioning works as well, because remember, we're talking about behaviors being followed by a reinforcing behavior. So sensory cues then predict that reward. Those neurons fire in response to that cue. So you present the cue, you get this feeling of reward already. So if the reward fails to occur, those neurons decrease their firing. So this reward prediction error signal is telling us when to expect a reward, and it actually is able to discriminate cues that provide rewards versus cues that don't provide rewards. Okay? Importantly, unexpected rewards result in much higher dopamine level releases and greater learning. This is the biological reason why that variable ratio schedule of reinforcement is much more powerful, because the reward is unexpected. When you expect it to come in the fixed ratio or fixed interval schedule, you just know it's coming. But that unexpected reward from that variable ratio schedule of reinforcement results in a much higher dopamine release, and as a result, much greater learning. This is the biological reason why gambling can be such a problem, because it results in a much greater dopamine release from that unexpected reward. This is the reason why surprising people with any kind of reward really does influence their behavior in very different ways from things that they just expect. So when we expect a reward, it's not nearly as reinforcing as something that's a surprising kind of reward. This gets directly involved in this idea of incentive salience. So the mesolimbic pathway enhances the motivational properties of cues that are predictive of rewards. So what's happening with incentive salience is this pathway in the reward pathway is actually motivating us to go out and seek those cues that are predictive of reward. So this gets us motivated to go out and find food, to go out and find sex, to go out and find money, whatever it is that we're getting rewarded from. This is the motivational part of that. So motivation in this pathway is associated with the amygdala, part of our primal emotional system, and this is referred to as incentive salience. What happens is these motivational states increase the incentive salience of rewards and related cues. That is, they become more salient and more incentivized. So we're much more likely to go out and seek them out, or we have much greater incentive to find those cues and be rewarded with them. So while the other parts of the reward system, the reward prediction error signal, tell us what's going to be rewarding, this actually gets us off our ass and gets us out there looking for whatever it is we're interested in finding. Now, this is what gets us up looking for jobs, looking for food, looking for sex. All of these things are part of this motivational state caused by incentive salience. So while the reward prediction error signal is telling us what's rewarding, incentive salience is what's getting us motivated to go out and find that reward. So the two are tied in with one another. And that's an important thing to understand, is that one is associated with predicting the reward, the other is incentivizing going out and getting that reward. All of this has a lot to do with maintaining our body's internal chemistry. We get thirsty, we get hungry, we want to pass on our genes, so we go out and have sex. All of these things are part of our basic biological motivation and drive. Bless you. The next major component of the reward system is what we call reward euphoria. This is where the high comes from that we associate with the reward pathway. So gambling, when we get a big win, when we get a big promotion, when we get an unexpected bonus, you get this feeling of reward euphoria. So most of the research in this area involves cocaine and amphetamines. And one of the biggest problems in this area is everyone equates activation of the nucleus accumbens with using cocaine. It's not the same. They may activate the same pathway, but certainly not at the same level, and certainly not in the same way, and certainly, and it's a huge problem, because then you get this muddying of the water. So people talk about Facebook use and shopping involve the same pathways as cocaine use, and now all of a sudden people think Facebook is cocaine, and only somebody who's never done cocaine would say that. They both cause substantial increases in synaptic dopamine, which is why they're used in these studies, because they're direct ways to cause this kind of change. We also know that if we put a blockade of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, it decreases reinforcing effects in animals. So if we block dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, we don't get reinforcement. So all of these lead to the idea that the nucleus accumbens is a really important part of this feeling of reward. And we can certainly see it in scans of the brain, that sort of thing. So this is where that feeling of reward comes from, is through activation of the nucleus accumbens. There are people who have had damage to the nucleus accumbens, and they suffer what we call anhedonia, which is an inability to sort of feel pleasure. So dopamine is a big part of this. We certainly know that the nucleus accumbens is active whenever we're getting this kind of feeling of reward. All tied in with this reward pathway. So all these pieces work together to incentivize us to go out and find rewards, to tell us which rewards are predictive, and to give us the kind of feeling of reinforcement that gets us to that reward. So this is the actual feeling of reward that we get comes from the nucleus accumbens. Any questions about how this all ties together? Well, the last part I want to talk about then has to do with how the reward pathway can result in the establishment of habits. So this can actually be both a good and a bad thing, depending on the kind of habit we're talking about. So this actually gets at anticipation of rewards. So one of the things that happens with habit formation is we start craving a reward or anticipating that reward. And as a result, we can make decisions that aren't necessarily in our best interest. So there are reciprocal connections from the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus that drive this kind of anticipation and craving. And so we can think about and anticipate a reward and sometimes even crave that reward. Important to understand, reductions in executive functions can contribute to the incentive salience of drugs and other artificial rewards over natural rewards. So what that means is people who have reductions in executive functioning, which can occur due to high stress, can occur due to any sort of brain injury, any sort of reduction in executive functioning, can make it so that drugs and other artificial rewards like gambling have greater incentive salience. So we're more likely to go out and find those and use those kind of rewards if we have reduced executive functioning. As a result, people with that kind of reduced executive functioning are at greater risk for drug addiction. One of the things I've tried to emphasize whenever I talk about drugs is this is a really important individualized experience. And so when people talk about the addictive nature of drugs, yes, some drugs can be addictive. Certainly opioids are it's a huge problem right now. But there are so many individual differences that go into that I don't like to make these kind of blanket statements that others do, because people will learn from their experience and their friends' experiences that not everyone is as susceptible to drug abuse as everyone else. And part of this has to do with things like our executive functioning. Unfortunately, we've started to discover people's intellectual functioning and executive functioning may be affected by things like poverty, long-term stress, and so you end up with pockets in certain communities that end up with higher drug addiction because of these kind of brain issues. So it's an important thing to think about. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about some applied research on rewards. We'll first talk about drugs of use and abuse. All drugs that have any kind of rewarding properties involve some sort of dopamine modulation. Some drugs affect dopamine directly, like cocaine and amphetamines. Others, like alcohol and opioids, have secondary effects on dopamine, but that's still where they get their reinforcing or rewarding effects from. So they don't all directly have an effect on dopamine, but they can indirectly modulate dopamine, which is why alcohol and opioids can be rewarding, even though they don't have a direct effect on dopamine itself. The most instantly rewarding of drugs do have this sort of large dopamine cascade. And some recreational drugs don't have any of this kind of reinforcement at all. So some of them are things like psychotropic drugs, etc., that don't tend to have an effect on dopamine. But people like them because they reduce their anxiety, and so can actually be negatively reinforcing. It's another thing to keep in mind. People don't just use drugs for their positive reinforcing effects. They also use them as self-medication. So people who have a great deal of anxiety or who maybe have attention deficit disorder will oftentimes self-medicate. So they'll use drugs like alcohol or sedatives to try to alleviate their anxiety, and they're reinforcing because they feel better because they're no longer anxious. So it's one of the things to keep in mind. Nicotine has this particular property in that people who are trying to quit nicotine become very anxious, and so the cigarette then alleviates that anxiety, it alleviates that withdrawal, and so that alleviation of withdrawal becomes negatively reinforcing. So it's important to understand, getting rid of withdrawal is actually a reinforcing property of drugs, it's just a negative reinforcer. Gambling. Interesting subjects who are given L-DOPA, which increases dopamine levels, actually spot winning strategies more quickly. So we know dopamine actually can affect this kind of incentive salience. We also know that increases in monetary reward result in the downgrading of losing symbols. That is, they actually were perceptually downgraded and downgraded in terms of the reward properties. So we start quickly. That is, the magnitude of a monetary reward affects that reward prediction error signal by getting a greater response from the winning symbols versus the losing symbols. As I said at the beginning of this little section on the reward pathway, this is the start of an area we call neuroeconomics. And so people have actually started looking at investment decisions and how the reward pathway is involved. Anticipation of gains in stock market investments activates the nucleus accumbens. A few of the people talking about the stock market as just cocaine on stocks. There's a weird correlation. Stockbrokers tend to like cocaine a lot. Sort of a major lore of Wall Street. Probably has something to do with they have a lot of money too. We also see gain outcomes activating the prefrontal cortex. So this mesial prefrontal cortex is how we start being able to predict gains. So we start seeing how the reward pathway is involved in things like investment decision making, also in shopping. Really clever study. We'll actually take a look at their data here in just a sec. But they looked at things like product preference and price. And what they found is that if you preferred a product and were able to purchase it, you got a reward in the nucleus accumbens. So shopping actually really is a little bit like other kinds of rewarding behaviors. Interestingly, excessive prices were associated with activation of the insula, which is involved in pain responses. So actually overpricing something that people liked caused a pain response. So it's almost punishing. So excessive prices actually can feel punishing to us in terms of this reward pathway. We also got deactivation of the mesial prefrontal cortex because of that excessive price, whereas before we were getting increased activation of that in investment outcomes. The mesial prefrontal cortex is involved in telling us sort of where we are in terms of gain and loss monetarily. There's been a lot of interest in trying to figure out how spending is different with cash and credit and debit cards. It's almost pretty much a given that people will actually spend cash more conservatively than they do using credit and debit cards. Part of this has to do with particularly credit cards. The pain involved or the sort of punishment involved in using them is often so far removed from their use that people are more likely to overspend with credit cards versus cash or debit cards. So this is a little look at the data from this shopping study. You can see this is the nucleus accumbens being activated during purchase of products they preferred. And you can see here activation of the insula, and deactivation of other areas associated with high prices. So final thoughts on reward. The reward system can downregulate due to repeated exposure to a reward, reducing the feeling of reward. Essentially, the brain's just not responding as strongly to the same reward repeatedly. This results in a number of things. People find some things to be less pleasing if they're sort of constantly rewarding themselves with it. Drugs like cocaine and amphetamines, people want more and more of to try to get that same feeling of reward. So you get sort of you can get escalating drug use. There's other things involved in that as well. Things like increased metabolism of the drug, more rapid metabolism of the drug, decreased responding to the presence of the drug. But you also get reduced feeling of reward from the same level. As I said a moment ago, disruption of the reward system can result in anhedonia, which is an inability to experience pleasure. This can become particularly problematic. Oftentimes, drug users who are trying to quit drugs like amphetamines and cocaine kind of go through a period of this while their brains are kind of resetting. There's also a whole sort of subculture involved in those drugs and sex at the same time. They call it chemsex. And so they've started to associate both sex and all their pleasure with the use of drugs. It can be problematic. So it's something to keep in mind. So finally, not all rewards are of the same magnitude. So when you see a study saying this is the same as cocaine, probably isn't. I mean, it may be involving the same pathway, but shopping at American Eagle is not the same as doing a rail of cocaine. So they're not the same thing. I wish people would stop saying they are the same thing, because they certainly are not. So that's something to keep in mind. Any questions on that? Nothing? All right. Well, we're going to quickly buzz through observational learning, and then we'll talk about emotion. As I posted to, I almost said Facebook, Canvas, I posted links to 2 lectures, one on motivation and one on intelligence, that'll cover what we missed last week. The ones I already had done, and we're right at that sort of point in the material anyway. So we'll get through. This will take just a few minutes, and we'll start emotion today, and then we'll finish it Wednesday, and that's all the material that will be covered on the exam. It'll be everything from consciousness up and through motivation. So we're skipping a chapter. We'll get to that after the exam. So observational learning, very straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. We learn through watching. So this is learning that occurs when behaviors are acquired or modified following exposure to others engaging in that same behavior. So a lot of us learn this way. This is how we learn to do a lot of things, by watching others do them and then trying to learn how to do that. There's a whole industry involved in teaching us how to do things like cook and tie a tie. I don't know how people learned how to do anything before YouTube. Almost everyone, half the people I know who know how to tie a bow tie learned it on YouTube. Anybody else like that? Yeah, I still haven't figured it out. So there's a classic set of studies in observational behavior, particularly in kids. Kids pick up things. Anybody who's been around kids knows they repeat a lot of things that you do. Albert Bandura did these really great set of studies with the Bobo doll. I keep forgetting. You can actually order a Bobo doll, you'll see here in a minute, from Amazon. Children viewed film of an adult interacting with the Bobo doll, and either they interacted with it aggressively or not. And after viewing the aggressive act by an adult, they were more than twice as likely to act aggressively towards the doll. We'll get back to that slide here in just a sec. This is my favorite slide ever. This girl attacking the Bobo doll with a hammer. I don't know if they gave her the hammer. I don't know where it came from. But she's going after Bobo. You can see a lot of this observational learning depends on if the model was rewarded. They were much more likely to engage in that behavior, particularly boys. This is in the 50s or 60s. If the model was punished, the girls were much less likely to engage in the behavior. There were no consequences, pretty much the same as the model being rewarded. So seeing that kind of aggression led to about twice as much aggressive behavior towards the doll as seeing any other kind of interaction. Anybody who's been around kids know they pick up things very quickly from adults. Anybody ever swear in front of their younger nieces or nephews or cousins? End up getting in trouble for that? Yeah, you guys know I swear a lot, so. I figured they'll pick it up somewhere, so it might as well be for me. Seem to have gotten a bunch of slides in here that I don't know where they came from. So this is from your book, the diffusion chain by which individuals initially learn. We'll skip that. It's all stuff from your textbook. This is observational learning in a surgical setting. Quite do it this way anymore, but people still do go in and observe surgery. It's one of the ways in which people learn how to do things. Here's some more slides of the Bobo doll. This kid's really getting after it. I mean, he's throwing Bobo. No, I need to just bring in one. We can just beat the crap out of it one day, and I'll feel better. Let's see what we have here. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about with observational learning, last couple things, is you can actually learn fear from others. Certainly know in some experiments, animals that are monkeys that are raised in the laboratory are generally not afraid of snakes because they've got no reason to be because they've never actually seen a snake. But if you bring in a monkey from the wild, they'll actually learn to fear snakes from wild monkeys. So they can actually learn from other animals to be afraid of things that they've never seen before. We know this is a kind of basic observational learning. What happens is this idea of modeling, where we imitate behavior through observational learning, model our behavior on others. So it's possible, for example, for parents to pass down their phobias or fears to their children because they see their parents being anxious or their parents being clearly fearful. You see this a lot with fear of dogs, fear of, snakes, spiders. Some of that's just basic common sense as far as I'm concerned. Having been bit by a snake, I guess I should say that that's perfectly reasonable to me. But people do actually model their behavior on seeing others. We can also learn to engage the behavior by seeing it rewarded in others. It's what we call vicarious reinforcement. So this occurs when a learning or when a behavior is observed being rewarded, and then the thought is, well, if that got rewarded to them, I should be able to get rewarded for it as well. So people learn by watching others and seeing them get reinforced for a behavior, and then try that behavior themselves. So as kids, again, you can see this often when one engages in a behavior and gets rewarded for it, then you might engage in that behavior. It happens as adults too. People try certain behaviors, pick-up lines, they see it getting rewarded, and they try it themselves. It doesn't always work, but kind of thing happens a lot. Final note on observational learning is there is a biological underpinning for this as well. There are what we call mirror neurons in the brain. These neurons respond to us seeing an action, and they also respond to us performing the exact same action. So mirror neurons are a way in which we can learn how to do things by observing and then engaging that behavior. It engages the exact same neural circuitry. We're going to talk about emotion next, and we think that mirror neurons play an important part of emotion as well, in that we think that mirror neurons play a role in our ability to sense someone else's emotional state, because the same neurons are used to create a smile that are used to actually process somebody else's smile. So facial expressions are an important cue about emotion, and we think that mirror neurons may be an important part of that empathy process where we can actually perceive someone else's mental state. And so there are a couple of areas of the brain that seem to be responsible for this that are involved in both sensory and motor areas and help us try to, we think, engage in this kind of observational learning. Any questions about that? All right. That is learning in all of its exciting glory. We're going to turn next and talk about emotions. This is another important area of psychology. We're going to get done in about, an hour and a half total, I think. We're going to start doing a basic introduction to emotions, and we'll talk about the adaptive nature of emotions. Why are emotions an important part of our experience? Why do they help us survive? What are their role in our lives? Talk about the experience of emotion, and then finally we'll finish up with the neurophysiology of emotions. Let's start with the basic introduction. So emotions are feelings that involve the subjective evaluation, physiological processes, and cognitive beliefs that are immediate reactions to events. So an emotional response is a subjective evaluation. It also involves a physiological process and a cognitive belief, and they're immediate reactions to events. That's opposed to mood. A mood is a diffuse state. Lasts over time. Emotions are responses to events. Affect, then, is our outward appearance of emotion. Oftentimes interchangeable with emotion, even though it's really not. When we talk about somebody's affect, we're usually talking about their outward state or their outward appearance. So, for example, we talk about patients with schizophrenia who are on antipsychotics often have what we call a flat affect. That is, they just show no facial expressions at all. So it's hard to tell what kind of mood someone's in if they have no outward experience of emotion. Moods, then, are diffuse and long-lasting emotional states that influence rather than interrupts our thoughts and behaviors. So emotional responses can interrupt what we're doing. We have an emotional reaction that will kind of intrude on our day, whereas a mood we've been in it all day anyway, right? So it's that kind of diffuse, long-lasting state. Again, it's an emotional state, but it's not an emotion itself. It's sort of a state of being over a longer period of time. So they can last hours, days. This is something we've all had experience with. I should note this is kind of the turning point in the class where we're getting a little bit out of, not entirely out of, the esoteric world of things like operant conditioning and classical conditioning, and into things that you probably experience more in your everyday life. So hopefully you'll find this a little bit more applicable to what's happening in your day, and probably also find it a little bit easier. Because, let's face it, we've all been in a bad mood, we've all been in a good mood. So we start having a little bit more understanding of this, whereas we haven't all really directly experienced operant conditioning. Anyway, just wanted to note that. Okay. To demonstrate the adaptive nature of emotions, I'm going to show this clip. It's kind of cheesy. It's also a little bit grim. So if you're a little grossed out by somebody sticking their finger in somebody's brain, I'm going to forewarn you what's going to happen here in a minute. But this is the story of Phineas Gage.
system is free to fire its messages of emotion uninhibited by the frontal cortex, and behavior becomes erratic and unpredictable. Against all odds, Gage survived. Physically. But he never did regain his emotional and intellectual self-control, balance, and judgment. His ability to communicate with other human beings decreased, but he developed a special affinity for animals. But for the men Gage used to work with, he had become a man out of control, the balance between his emotions and his intellectual faculties destroyed. Gage died 12 years later, still unbalanced. At the Warren Museum in Harvard, the tapping rod and Gage's skull are preserved, a monument to research into how physical changes in the brain affect behavior.
All right, so that's the story of Phineas Gage. Probably one of the sort of earliest and classic cases of case studies in psychology. Gage became a bit of a carnival sideshow for quite a while. Him and the tamping rod, you can see pictures of him at sideshows with the tamping rod. And he'd lost his one eye, so didn't quite look as well put together as in this video. There's also been a lot of interest in sort of reconstructing Gage's skull and brain. So Hannah and Antonio Damasio have actually taken scans of his skull and then figured out what a brain inside it would have been injured, and tried to sort of examine how that sort of damage resulted in his behavior. It's a book called Descartes' Error, where they talk about how emotion and rationality are tied together. So what you can see from a case like Gage's is that our emotions are an important part of our functioning, as is having control over those emotions. So there's this delicate balance between our sort of primitive emotions and our ability to control them. And so the frontal lobe is actually what exerts control over the limbic system. One of the other things that we know about emotions is they actually help us navigate our social environment. In fact, actually, they're a powerful form of nonverbal communication that are an important part of basically how we survive. So I want to take a look at just a quick look at some of the sort of universal facial expressions and how they help us to elicit sort of forgiveness in others, that sort of thing. So infants use facial expressions for communications. Infants actually, is how they get attention from adults is by smiling, laughing, changing their facial expressions. We know that displays of emotions can alter the behavior of others, something we learn early on, that displaying emotion actually can help us change the behavior of others. So, for example, crying, being upset, or showing embarrassment, for example. So if you're out at a restaurant somewhere and you run into somebody and spill their drink, by showing that you're embarrassed and sorry actually helps elicit that kind of forgiveness, whereas if you just don't show any emotion at all, that's going to make them angry. But if you show that you're embarrassed by that behavior, then that actually elicits that kind of forgiveness. We also know that species use facial expressions, and there seems to be some generality to the kinds of facial expressions we see in different species. So you can look at, for example, in chimpanzees versus dogs or wolves, different kinds of clear emotional states based on their facial expression. So take a closer look at these. The basic different kinds of facial expressions. This is my dog Peanut. She has that facial expression a lot. She can also give a stink eye like no other dog I've ever seen, kind of like this one up here. So dogs actually do have different facial expressions, you can see. We also know that across cultures we see sort of universal facial expressions. So some facial expressions appear to be universal and thus likely to be biologically based. But identification of specific emotions is best within a culture. One of the main differences across cultures is when it's appropriate or culturally appropriate to exhibit a particular emotion and by whom. This is obviously something that changes over time. Cultures start to change and evolve, but we see different kinds of display rules for different kinds of emotions. In particular, we see gender-based display rules. That is, there are sort of gender differences in display rules in general. Women display emotions more often, more intensely, and more easily. Again, this is a sort of thing that's rapidly evolving and rapidly changing in terms of cultural norms and cultural expectations. But in general, this is something we see. And now if it's something innate or learned, I guess this is probably more learned than anything else. We tend to reward emotional displays in women, but not in men. In fact, men are often ridiculed for displaying emotion. Okay, why don't we finish there rather than start on the cognitive functions of emotions. We only have about 2 minutes left. We'll pick up here, and whatever we get through on Wednesday is what will be on the exam.